Today we're taking another break from Call of Duty, and we're instead going to be taking a look at a different game that I'm actually pretty hyped to see more about. Yesterday was the PlayStation Showcase, in which there were a few cool games shown off. Probably the biggest you saw out of that was Spider-Man 2, Alan Wake 2, Assassin's Creed Mirage, and the new Final Fantasy, but one that really caught my attention, not only for the aesthetic and the gameplay details we learned about, but also because it consisted of probably one of the coolest ARGs that we've seen in a long time, or alternate reality games, the way that the community can end up learning more about the game, unlocking pieces of information along the way. Think Pawn Takes Pawn out of the Cold War year a couple of years ago, and other things that we've seen in the COD franchise, but on a much larger scale with this one here. But this one was probably one of the coolest we've seen in the gaming space entirely for a long time, but that game was Marathon. Today we're running down what Marathon is, what you should know, and where to look for more. So today is much different than COD, much different than what we normally do. So if you enjoy the video, you find it at all insightful, or if you just want to do me a favor, drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you guys are new and want to stay up to date with not only just Call of Duty content, but other FPS content here on the channel as well. Trying to branch out into a little bit more. I'd love to have you in the community if you're interested. But for now, let's jump into a little bit about Marathon. So before there was Destiny, before there was even Halo, Bungie developed the Marathon trilogy all the way back in 1994. This is not necessarily that exact formula that we ended up seeing back then, that being just more so a first-person shooter that was one of the defining Mac gaming games out there at the time, but this instead is going to be a PvP extraction FPS, with gameplay built similar to how Destiny and Halo mechanics end up working, but not necessarily one-to-one. Anything more than that, they didn't really quite detail, but that was the sort of baseline and guide they gave us in some of the information about the game. Players are known as runners, which as runners, you're going to be interacting with the world looking for loot, other runners, and other different artifacts you can end up extracting. You can end up having gameplay modifiers to not only just your own customization, but also your playstyle customizables as well, seemingly sort of upgrades to your character as you go along. You can play solo or with a squad, upwards of seemingly 3 other runners or players, and you'll end up finding a whole ton of different loot from weaponry and things like that, all the way to what are called artifacts, where you can find pieces of artifacts, but you can keep looking, you can keep trying to loot and extract with other pieces to ultimately then make a prime artifact. So sort of a multi-step puzzle for an overall larger item that you can extract with, kind of thinking like how recently we had in DMZ that Heated Madness blueprint for the 7.6.2. That was something you had to extract 6 different pieces of that, but instead it seems like this will be something you have to extract multiple in one go to end up getting that prime artifact. So this is something that's the basic general gameplay loop and gist of it here, but beyond that, we learned a little bit about some of the platforms supported and some of the gameplay experience overall. This is going to be current generation only, so PlayStation 4 and Xbox One will not be in the equation. Instead, you're going to be able to play it on PlayStation 5, Xbox Series S and X, as well as PC, which is kind of interesting to consider because Bungie was recently acquired by Sony and PlayStation last July for $3.7 billion. So for them to be able to make something here that is then, as we'll touch on in just a second, cross-platform, cross-progression and everything, it's definitely interesting that this is not necessarily so focused in the marketing on the PlayStation side really just yet in gameplay. Yes, obviously we saw this debuted at the PlayStation Showcase. I would also imagine that we end up seeing some sort of bonus points that are focal to PlayStation in the game once we end up learning more and once the game is out there. Wouldn't be surprised if we end up seeing bonuses for like how we see in the COD scene with some sort of exclusive item, some sort of exclusive bonus reward, or whatever the case may be. But for the time being, it will be on PlayStation 5, Xbox Series S and X, as well as PC. So I absolutely see that as a win. But again, coming back to it, it will be cross-platform and cross-progression, where you can play with your friends on any platform, and if you own the game on multiple platforms, you can jump back and forth and all your items will still be there, which is definitely beautiful. One thing that I think is a very underrated feature here and might not be utilized as much as just say cross-play, cross-progression is definitely something that if you have multiple platforms, it's very nice to be able to jump back and forth if you want to. Now, one thing that'll definitely be interesting here out of this in Marathon is that it's going to be multiplayer only. There's no campaign here with this, and I find that interesting, and a lot of other people find that interesting and somewhat disappointing to a degree, because the history of the Marathon trilogy was one that was really built out on the universe and the lore on top of the front-facing campaign style narrative that we saw in those original games. It's stated to be set in the same universe, but not a direct sequel to any of those 3 games already existing from the 90s. One big thing that they stressed was that you don't need to know the story story of Marathon leading into it, as nearly 30 years later, naturally that audience probably isn't the same. I know personally, looking into it, I wish I was able to play the game firsthand whenever it came out, but I mean, it came out a month before I was born, so kind of hard to play through that when you're not even born yet. However, they did say, even if you do not know that, you're totally fine, but if you do know the story of Marathon and the stories told throughout those 3 games, you will absolutely see plenty of nods and homages to the original storylines. However, for the narrative here, while there's not going to be a dedicated campaign, each player or runner is included in an unfolding narrative that will continue and persist through the seasons of support post-launch. To what capacity, we don't quite know just yet, but it is mentioned that there will be gameplay elements that tell the story further, so perhaps cutscenes, Easter eggs, perhaps terminals like the original Marathon game that give you additional intel and information on the narrative going on around you, beyond just the survive and extract gameplay loop. Now, as for the multiplayer world and what you'll end up experiencing, again, very little is known at the moment, but they did detail a little bit about the world itself being vibrant and dangerous with persisting zones, which leaves a lot open for speculation. Does persistent zones mean constant maps and infill locations comparable to like Tarkov has their maps, DMZ has the maps of like Al Mazrah, Building 21, Koshi Complex, and Ashika Island? Does persistent mean that there's no real set time on refreshes or sort of resets on those worlds and the infill locations? There was a project a few years back that is just kind of, for comparison, does not have anything to do with this, but there was a proposed game and battle royale with a never-ending match that could be interesting, that maybe this takes some sort of framework off of, where we don't have a 30-minute timer or a 5-hour timer or something like that before the match ends up resetting. It refreshes the entire world. Instead, it could be something that could go on for days perhaps, but again, that's just speculation at the moment. However, persistent zones was something explicitly named and detailed by the developers at Bungie. Now, it's not explicitly stated if there is PvE, but it's almost insinuated by the mention that the world will push back and that the world is air quote dangerous. So we'll see how that works out if it ends up becoming a PvPvE game rather than just the PvP mention of it so far, but we'll see how that works out. They did mention that the world will be interactable on a larger scale though, which is pretty cool, because the example they gave was essentially unlocking a zone for part of these maps where maybe you require a key or an item to unlock one area, but then to go further, you have to do some sort of like Easter egg to open up the next part. But at the same time, whenever you do that, because it is a persistent zone, because it is a persistent world, other players will see these changes being made. It is something that seemingly may end up being a one-time unlock for some of these Easter eggs, which is really interesting to see how that will all break down. Though it also ties in hand with the mention that as a player or players open up areas or do some sort of things, some of them will be immortalized in that area for being like the first in the world to do so. So kind of cool to see that communal back and forth and interaction with the world on a much deeper level like that. Now, beyond that, the only other things they mentioned were some technical aspects where, because it is going to be multiplayer only, obviously there needs to be some layer of security here. Dedicated servers are on the way, disconnect recoveries are coming, and major security enhancements, so hopefully that means like a good anti-cheat going along with all of that. So what's next? Honestly, I think that package we just described sounds pretty intriguing, sounds pretty cool. Sure, extraction shooters might not be your cup of tea. It does seem like the industry is kind of curving towards that a little bit here, where that might be the next big thing past the BR craze. But what's next here for Marathon? Well, they did say that there was going to be an alpha coming soon, and it seemed like we will be able to get our hands on and play it during that time. They also stated, though, that they're going to be going dark, but we'll have gameplay and more details when they come back. But the next question is, when will it overall release? Because there is no set date or time frame yet on when this will release. If I'm taking a guess, I'd probably say like early 2024, based off of them not even being an alpha just yet, based off as just being a basic announcement of stuff. But they did say that when they come back from going dark, they will be close to launch. So very curious to see how that goes, and if that means they'll launch the game in like a beta state with constant live service updates. As they had mentioned, the alpha would be shown off with their return, but if the alpha is being shown off at their return and then they're going to be close to launch, well, you kind of see that that leap from alpha to beta might not necessarily be the craziest idea in the world. So we'll have to see how this all shakes up. Right now, there is, again, still very little known, but from what is known, I'm very intrigued. I'm very excited to see what more can come of this. Yes, Bungie has had hits and misses, but very excited to see what comes of it at the very least. Love to see some gameplay here soon, but I think we might be waiting for a bit before that. But that said, wanted to fill you guys in here on a cool little project that I'm personally excited for. Let me know your thoughts down below if you guys are as well. But all that said, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, do me a favor and drop a like on it. And if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing to stay up to date with all things Marathon, all things Call of Duty, and all things other FPS content here in the future. For now though, thanks so much for watching. My name is Espresso. I'll see you guys later. Take care and peace.